In times of war and disaster, aid in whatever form can save lives. It can rebuild ravaged communities. But is the relevance of the big charities, the NGOs, being threatened by what some say is increased nationalism in the West and a geographical shift in global power? We're talking about that on Roundtable with me, David Foster. More and more crises, migration, conflict, and natural disasters, and more politics and complications around all of that. The world is moving fast. Some countries emerging, others starting to look inward. And global power, some suggest, is changing. So how do big aid organizations operate in this environment? One major report says they need to radically rethink if they want to survive.
Every day we have 5,000 more Yemenis falling sick.
We've got more than 20 million people who are at risk of famine in just 4 countries.
We've all seen the horrific trauma that so many Syrians have felt as they've gone through this conflict.
Over the last 10 years, the world has become a more dangerous place. From those ravaged by war and natural disasters, for millions of people, NGOs are a lifeline.
It is clear that globally we are entering very turbulent times.
But how well prepared are these organisations for future problems? Some aid groups say charities need to adapt their structure, operations and values to remain relevant and successful. 1 in 50 people around the world need humanitarian help. Last year, over 65 million people were displaced from their homes, almost double the number in 1996. It's predicted that by 2030, nearly half the world's population will live with the threat of violence or conflict. As the nature of conflict and its aftershocks shift, some say the aid landscape must change too. The transfer of aid has traditionally been from the Northern Hemisphere to poorer countries in the South. But now that relationship is changing. A growing number of emerging countries are relying less on foreign aid.
The South is not one thing anymore. There are some very, very poor countries that are very strongly dependent on foreign aid. Many countries of the South are they have their own aid programs, and so they're initiating or expanding their aid programs.
Their fears a rise in nationalist policies in the West could see a drop in the amount of aid given to poorer countries.
From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.
The US has the world's largest foreign aid budget, $30 billion. But President Trump says he wants to slash it by around a third.
Even though the US may be reducing its aid budgets, it gets blurred into, security and other sorts of, other policy objectives, international policy objectives. So it becomes very hard to actually keep track these days of exactly what aid is and, how its extent is changing.
Where there are natural disasters and conflict, poverty often follows, and the need for aid. But as local communities increasingly help themselves and aid agencies try to adapt and restructure, will we see an end to big aid? And what could that mean for the communities who need it?
With us at Roundtable today from Washington, D.C., Gret Geiler, who's the founder of the app DonorSee, which allows donors to see where their donations have gone. And he believes that large NGOs are often characterized by a lack of transparency, accountability and efficiency. To my right, James Denzilo, Head of Conflict and Humanitarian Policy at Save the Children, who thinks that aid can address big problems and can reach millions of people in need. To my left, Dina Mansour-Illa from the Overseas Development Institute, who believes large NGOs need to learn how to collaborate better with those on the ground. And we have the founder of the African news outlet Viewpoint Africa, Io Johnson, who believes NGOs should focus on promoting good governance in developing countries rather than maintaining aid reliance. Thank you all very much for joining us on Roundtable. Greg Geiler, let me put to you something that you said to one of our producers when she asked the question, what does the future hold for charities if they don't die? And you said very bluntly, I hope they die a quick death. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me on your show. And for decades, we have been dealing with billions and billions of dollars of people spending that is completely no transparency, no accountability, and frankly, there's a lot of improper incentives in place. And so what I'd like to see is the general public be educated on this, and we move as quickly as possible away from this reckless spending.
So it's not so much that you want to see the end of them, you want to see the end of them as they are.
I want to see the end of people, of billions of dollars of money spent where there's no tracking, there's no way of knowing if it was used efficiently. And in a lot of cases, the aid is used improperly and it hurts the economy, and there's no consequences for that. We live in the year 2017. I don't think we need to keep living like that anymore.
Gret, I know you refer to the American Red Cross as the American Dead Cross. That's your estimation of that group. But there was a lot of criticism during the Haiti disaster of the money that went there from the American Red Cross. I don't know who wants to pick up on this one. But it suggested that almost $500 million was spent. But the organization in itself saw the tragedy in Haiti as a, quote, a spectacular fundraising opportunity and did little or no good.
Well, David, that's true, but the bottom line is that aid is required sometimes when we need emergencies, like happening right now in Sierra Leone. There's a flood, victims have died, people need to be rescued. That type of aid to help individuals who are in the pressing need at that time is crucial. I think aid has got to become slightly more sharper, slightly smarter. And what we don't need is aid that involves large volumes of money in the hundreds of millions from government to government, or from agencies to agencies. That's where it goes into bureaucracy and theft, and eventually the trickle down that we expect to happen on the ground never happens.
So how do you sort something like this out, James? With a big organisation like Save the Children, if you give it straight to a government, it could just vanish.
Of course, and that's why we're an operational NGO. We do these programs ourselves, and I think, starting with the premise of this debate, I think we have to fully accept that the world is changing, and all of us have to adapt to that change, whether you're in the media sector or in the political sector or in the NGO sector. I think there's no kind of position that says this is how it's done, this is how it will always be done. I think we do have to adapt to modern trends, whether they be changing nature of conflict, more protracted, more urban, more amongst civilians, climate change and the impact that has on natural disasters and preparedness for them. Because I think ultimately, often you see when a disaster strikes, whether it's a landslide or an earthquake, that the public is mobilized to give in huge amounts, and often NGOs aren't necessarily prepared to turn those donations into effective aid.
I suppose they should be, because it's the business that they're in. So how do they do something like that? Make it more efficient, more relevant?
Well, I think they should better collaborate with local NGOs. So if the money is concentrated with one big entity, I think that's not efficient use of the money. So I think the better distribution is a smarter aid at the end of the day. So I think if big NGOs collaborate better with local NGOs, they reach the communities much better, and this fosters this engagement between local and international NGOs.
And I fully agree with that. That's exactly what we're doing in a place like Syria, an incredibly difficult aid environment because of the security situation there. And so we're having to do things differently to reach children in besieged areas or reach children who are fleeing from places like Aleppo. But that's done through local partnership.
But there's a notion that the public is fatigued, tired. You can't be going to the well every time and asking for more money, and they're asking, what are you doing with that money, and showing the same pictures which reflect death, disease, and destruction. And I think when you have crisis in Somalia, for example, where amount of money is required, the voting public says, we can't help you. We can't give you the money you require. That's why your numbers are down.
But in part, that's because they're not sure that the money's going to the right place, which is where somebody like Greg Geiler comes in with his app, Donor Seat. Tell us how it works. If I signed up to your service and wanted to know how much of my money was going to Save the Children or wherever else, and how it was being used, how would it work?
Yeah, I'll put it in very simple terms. Usually when you give to a large charity of some kind, what happens is you send them a donation, and then a month later they might send you an email saying, hey, thanks for the donation, can we have more money? DonorsChoose is very different. Let's say there's a girl in India who needs hearing aids, and you donate to her through the DonorsChoose app. A few days later, you'll get a video of that girl hearing for the very first time. And the way that we do this is it's a two-sided marketplace. So there are people who post projects on one side of the world, and then there are people who want to give in a more compelling way on the other side of the world, and we match them together.
And does it work that if you want to take a look at one of the bigger entities, and we mentioned Save the Children because James is here, you can see how they work, or is it just on this one-to-one basis?
For the moment, it's just on a one-to-one basis. We're less than a year old, and we're expanding quickly, and we're in over 50 countries. And we have plans to work alongside NGOs in the future, but for the moment, it's just a one-to-one basis.
And James, you're nodding your head. You like the idea.
Well, I think, again, we should always strive for greater accountability, greater transparency. And I think, going back to your point about donor fatigue, if people feel they are donating to things that never end and are seemingly impossible to solve, I think that will exacerbate the problem. Although, ironically enough, we are seeing, for example, on the recent DEC appeal for the East Africa food crisis,
Disasters Emergency Committee.
Yeah, sorry, there has been actually more money than ever donated. So I think I'm constantly impressed by the British public and other publics' desire to continually give to things that seem intractable. So I think you're right. We can't take that for granted. We can never say that this is the way it will be in the future.
But I think it would be far more effective if you had a story to tell. You've been around for the past 100 years or so. If you could tell a story that showed someone, say, when they were 7, and show exactly the support you gave them, and where they are now in their 80s or 90s or even 70s, to tell that story of success. You've got none of that to show us. So where's the confidence?
I want to throw this one out there, sorry, James, if I may, which is that you talk about the need to adapt, to survive. But it occurs to me that the only reason you're having to do that is because you've discovered at long last that what's been going on doesn't work. So you've been forced to do this by circumstance, not by clever, out-of-the-box thinking.
Well, I don't think that's right. I think, as I say, it comes down to what you want to do, and we want to reach more children who need aid with aid. We reached 22 million children last year. And I think the approach we have, and we've always had, is wanting to do the most with what we have. And I don't think it's a sense of we've been forced to do this. We're doing it because it's the right thing to do. And it goes back to one of the concepts that was made in that package, that do we change our values as humanitarian actors? And that's the one area I would disagree with. The values of independence, neutrality, impartiality, and humanity, I think, are completely essential for us to work as we do.
And I hope we get down to the basis of sort of, how aid can help if it's in local communities in just a moment. But you were agreeing with that sentiment.
I was agreeing of not changing the values. I think you should change the way you do it and how to reach your goals at the end of the day. So at the end of the day, what you want to do is reach that person or that community and help it develop. So you don't change your values for that, but you have to change the way you operate based on the context and based on the restrictions. And we should never ignore the fact that NGOs serve more than just humanitarian assistance or delivering services. They also serve in advocacy and policy changes, which are much bigger than just, like delivering services.
I suppose the point I was trying to bring out there was that some NGOs are so big that they're almost aloof. They are detached from the situation. You go back to a report that was commissioned by Médecins du Monde, in which they asked 17 of the biggest French NGOs to give them their opinions of corruption and transparency. 11 of the 17 refused to take part in that, effectively saying, sorry, it's not us.
It's a confidence thing. I think some charities, some NGOs are realizing that aid truly doesn't really work. And they want aid that shows promise. And we don't have that. So the notion is, why feed a man fish when you can teach him how to fish? And that's where the NGOs are failing. You must allow the people to have a mechanism which allows them to be subsistent on their own moving forward. And the agencies have struggled to achieve that.
Give a man a fish, you give him a fish, teach him how to fish, and you...
Exactly. And of course that's why we do so much education projects, because ultimately if you have children in places like Lebanon and Turkey outside of education, then their ability to have a successful future is hugely impaired. So I agree with you. You need to be sustainable and strategic in the way you approach these things. Education currently in the Middle East, we're seeing a huge number of children outside of school because of conflict, and it should be on all of our consciences, it should be on all of our priorities, because without that we really do face a lost generation.
Okay, we're going to come to the tools that people need in just a moment, but I'm going to put this question to Gret in Washington, D.C., and Ayo, since you work so much in Africa, I want you to come up with your ideas for this one. Sub-Saharan Africa, Gret, apparently gets about $134 billion in aid every year, and yet it's still one of the poorest places on earth. Where do you think the money's going?
Well, so, I mean, I spent 3 years living in Malawi, and during my second year there, I can tell you that there was a big scandal that was uncovered called Cashgate, where it was found out that billions and billions of kwacha, the local currency there, was being siphoned by the local government officials, and it was just being pocketed. So money that was supposed to be going to hospitals and starving people in rural areas, that money was just being stolen and taken by the local government officials. And there were reports that came out about this. There was a little bit of turmoil for a few short months, and then after that, everyone forgot about it because that's how things work.
A guy called, I'm sorry, I do forget his name, but he's the founder of a charity called Send a Cow. Yeah? Says we should look on this not as aid, but as investment.
You're investing in the people, which is why I was telling that story. People that need support, that asking for help. If you give large amounts of money to government and you work outside of a framework of which the political system is capable of adapting, then fraud and corruption takes hold. And so when you have a broken system, ultimately, which can go back as far as colonialism, people would say that that's where it started off, from the time when in the 70s where countries were asking for financial support from the IMF and World Bank, and the policies that shrunk those governments to nothing ultimately led to the disaster we have now and the growth of the NGOs. So I think when you look at that, if they're pouring good money into bad environments, we do not have the structure and mechanisms to support the people, then of course naturally corruption takes hold.
The question is obviously, if I want to help, it's much easier for me if I just ask one person, because I will know that I'm getting attention that way. The scattergun approach doesn't necessarily work, but how do you make sure and how do you identify who needs the help and who's best to give it in that situation?
I think that's the challenge. You need local NGOs to tell you exactly where to feed into the money. But at the same time, you need to ask yourself whether or not you can channel this money well through NGOs. So you need to work with different actors in order to achieve your goals, including NGOs.
I think we work in 120 countries, and sometimes what's interesting, having that local knowledge, having a long-term presence in a place, for example, in Southeast Asia, where we had development programs that suddenly were completely turned around by the tsunami and the need for humanitarian emergency programs, but it's only because we knew those environments that we're able to provide it. But going back to the point about money being pushed through a sieve, I think there's a definite contrast between countries like Turkey that have a very developed humanitarian system of their own, and that's currently playing host to the largest refugee population on the planet, a place where you can clearly support the actors there to do the work they're doing, versus the Central African Republic, where you have very little governance, very little ability to sort of give money to others, and you have to do your own professional programming in a place that comes to it to avoid the money being wasted.
But isn't that hypocritical? Because you're depending on that mix. You're depending on the chaos on the ground, you're depending on the fact that governments are not performing well, because otherwise you'd be out of a job.
Well, I mean, I think you're right to say, in a way, we shouldn't want to exist at all, right? We are, as aid agencies, dealing with the symptoms of problems. We don't want to have to work in CAR, but we have to because of the situation there in terms of the children suffering.
Well, you've been around for the last 100 years, and hopefully you're looking forward to the next 100. So when we speak in
100 years' time, hopefully it's all done.
I understand exactly what you're suggesting about not wanting to be around in a certain minute. Gret, in Washington, D.C., are you encouraged by what you hear from people who are involved in the bigger organizations, in the grassroots on the ground?
You asked about the bigger organizations and the grassroots on the ground. Are those two separate questions?
It's up to you. Take it any way you want. Are you encouraged by what you hear?
Sure. I think yes and no. One of the interesting things that was brought up earlier was how do we deal with all of these, how do we deal with so many different cultures and customs and so forth. So, for example, there's 54 different countries in Africa alone, and then in each and every one of those 54 countries, often there's possibly 1,000 different dialects with 1,000 different cultural customs and 1,000 different types of needs that would be necessary to execute aid efficiently in those countries. And so I think one of the things that I find troubling with the big aid organizations is they're in over 100 different countries. They have their footprint in so many different places. And then there's people at the top of these organizations making pretty big decisions that affect multiple different contexts. And what I am trying to do with DonorsC, and what I see a lot of other people moving to a more grassroots effort, the effort is made to understand people's context first before we start trying to be the saviors of these individuals that are in need of assistance.
See, Dina, one of the things is that, and it's been brought up already, is that many emergency situations happen in countries which are badly organised anyway, where there is an awful lot of corruption. So you add that to the problems as outlined there by Gret, and the difficulties are multiplying in many ways because of the complex nature of those problems and the world in which we live these days.
Definitely, and that's why you need more than one actor on the ground, and that's why you need the big organizations in addition to the small ones, because the small ones, the grassroots organizations, do lack a lot of capacity, do lack a lot of funding. They need to collaborate much better with...
Are you changing your approach along those lines?
Well, I fully agree. I think we need to recognise that it's not either or. It's not large NGOs or small NGOs. It's a good, healthy ecosystem in which we're able to help the most people the most effectively for the most sustainable strategic reasons.
Well, fragile states is what we have. Every country on the African continent is a fragile state, and across the world where we have crises, it's their fragility which is slightly more exposed when we have these crises, which makes them seem apparently useless to be able to support the mechanism. So it doesn't really matter how much money, how much effort, how much energy or desire will, if the mechanisms to support and hold and to help those that need it at the bottom end never happen.
And I think we should be careful about looking to NGOs to be able to answer some of these governance and political challenges ultimately. I mean, as I say, we are the sticky plaster on some of these big issues, and we can't aspire, unfortunately, to be the ones who answer.
Perhaps it needs somebody with a bigger overall.
Well, I think that's where international governance isn't really working.
Who would it be?
Well, I think we still look to our political leaders to address the issues of war and peace, issues of climate change. That's the.
But the irony is, you could then end up with somebody who's a leader in an African country, who is a corrupt leader in an African country, looking after the governance of other things as well.
Guess what?
There's no problem. No solution.
Aid is now used not just to help.
And we should say that 25% of all aid raised or given in the world comes through NGOs.
There we go. So not all aid is there to help people. It's actually there to prop up governments. It's there to support initiatives. It's there to actually keep governments to suppress their individual populations. So aid is it's a weapon. To you, it may appear helping, but it could be propping up, supporting, encouraging, holding on to regimes which should have disappeared a while ago.
So do you talk about sanctions when it comes to aid? You withdraw the aid unless you do something else. I've seen that suggested in terms of good governance.
Well, it wouldn't surprise me. The IMF, the World Bank, all these institutions, the African Union, they've got to do far more.
But I think we're mixing many cards here. So if we're going to talk about the IMF and the World Bank, that's a very political aid. And if we look at Arab countries, for example, that receive huge amounts of aid from IMF and World Bank, it's really corrupting the governments even more. But if we look at humanitarian organizations, that's totally different. And I think we're mixing very much the cards here by looking at aid as the big demon out there and the big
Okay,
beast.
25% of all aid is money that is given to NGOs. What do you do with it? How do you make it better in the end?
David, one last thing I'll just say this, is that you must stop the drug addiction syndrome, which is, there are governments there which are dependent on 70% of their budget. It's got to be aid. So they've now become like drug addicts. They need that fix, and the aid is the only thing that corrects that fix, but it's not helping them. They need treatment. They need a bigger framework to support them. Otherwise, the aid is not going to help. It's not helping them.
And is the sort of framework that we're looking at, starting with I don't mean this disparagingly, but I mean small players like you with your app, is that the way of taking it forward?
Again, I think we should separate state-to-state aid versus non-governmental aid. I do think we need to, and looking at what Greg's doing, we need to obviously adapt the latest technology, the latest ways of working. These are all part of this complex world we live in. Again, it goes back to my point that we don't just say, this is it, this is how we do things. I think it's being kind of able to be self-critical and reflective, to be able to know that we can always be better, to seek to always be better, which is exactly what we try and do.
Yeah, and Greg, I suppose the one thing is that we must never forget in all of this, not only are there poor disadvantaged people on the ground who need the help, but an awful lot of those people who go in to help them are putting their own lives at risk just to do what they can.
Right. I hear what you're saying, and I think there's a lot of truth in some of the conversation that's happening right now. I think one of the things we have to be honest about is we keep talking, you asked the question, what are we going to do with 25% of the money that's going to NGOs? And I didn't hear a very good answer for that. I heard how are we not going to spend the money, but how are we going to spend the money? How are we going to execute on this? That's the thing where big aid organizations have had decades to execute on, and we haven't seen any improvement, or very marginal, very few exceptions amongst a sea of disappointment.
I'm not sure if
quick summary, if you can, because we don't have very long.
I'm not sure if we do have evidence for them not improving the situation. I think the first people who enter in a disaster were always the international NGOs, and I think we cannot ignore the fact that they were always there and they were always helping.
Yeah, I suppose that the problem is that if you give £100 and £1 of that £100 saves a life, it is a life saved. It's what do you do to make the use of the remaining £99?
Of course, I don't think that is the balance. The balance is far and away on programmes, and so I would completely contest this notion of a sea of despair. And I said, if you want to see the opposite of that, visit a school we run, and visit a school we run underground, because in places like Syria they can't be overground, otherwest they're bombed. Visit a clinic that's helping children recover from losing limbs.
Thank you. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us on Roundtable. Complex, fast-moving times, I think we've all agreed, but can the big aid charities actually keep up the pace and continue to give that help where it's most needed and in the best way? That has been Roundtable with me, David Foster. Thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you next time. Until then, goodbye.